Welcome back to our channel, your ultimate destination for the most thrilling and deeply emotional updates from the world of daytime drama. Today is a spectacular day to dive deep into the labyrinthine corridors of passion, betrayal, and obsession that define the lives of our favorite Los Angeles families. Grab a comfortable seat and prepare yourself, because the stakes have never been higher and the twists have never been darker. Let us unravel the chilling new reality that is about to shatter the Forrester and Spencer legacies forever. The glittering facade of high fashion and corporate warfare at Forrester Creations has suddenly been eclipsed by a terrifying descent into psychological horror. For weeks, the atmosphere has been thick with tension, manipulation, and broken hearts, primarily revolving around the complex love quadrangle of Will Spencer, Electra Forrester, R.J. Forrester, and Melissa Dillon. While audiences watched Ivy Forrester unapologetically orchestrate the destruction of Will and Electra's relationship by intercepting a crucial gallery letter, a much darker, far more dangerous storm was brewing in the fragile mind of Melissa Dillon. The transition from a heartbroken woman entangled in a messy romance to a deeply disturbed individual crossing the point of no return is a tragic and terrifying spectacle to behold. To understand the sheer magnitude of this catastrophic turn of events, one must examine the immense psychological pressure Melissa Dillon has been enduring. Already burdened by the immense guilt of coming between Will and Electra, Dillon's sanity began to fracture under the weight of mysterious, threatening phone calls from a disguised voice claiming they had unfinished business. The looming specter of these calls, combined with wild speculations surrounding her potential involvement in the tragic death of Luna Nozawa, created a toxic cocktail of paranoia and desperation. Dillon was a woman standing on the absolute edge of a precipice, desperately searching for a lifeline or a reason to keep fighting for the distorted reality she desired. That fatal push over the edge came from an unexpected and entirely unintentional source, R.J. Forrester. During a tense conversation in the design office, R.J., fueled by his own selfish desires to clear his path to Electra, coldly refused to actively help Dillon's scheme any further. However, in a moment of calculated manipulation, R.J. advised the guilty and conflicted Dillon not to give up on pursuing Will. He psychoanalyzed her, telling her that deep down, she wanted Electra out of Will's life entirely. To a rational mind, this was merely terrible advice born of ulterior motives. To Dillon's rapidly deteriorating psyche, it was a profound revelation and a direct command. If R.J. would not help her, and if the universe was conspiring against her, she would have to forcefully orchestrate her eternal union with Will Spencer with her own two hands. Left entirely to her own devices, Dillon's interpretation of not giving up morphed into a terrifying, claustrophobic obsession. The execution of her dark fantasy began in the desolate, shadow-drenched corners of the Forrester Creations parking lot. Will Spencer was already emotionally exhausted and physically drained. He had just endured the agonizing revelation that Ivy Forrester felt absolutely zero remorse for intercepting Electra's letter and destroying their happiness. Furthermore, Will had just navigated yet another hostile confrontation with R.J., maintaining his composure while reminding R.J. that he was not even a real Forrester. Will's mind was entirely preoccupied with the daunting task of piecing his relationship with Electra back together, leaving him completely vulnerable and oblivious to the predator lurking in the shadows. The abduction was executed with chilling, meticulous precision. The ambient hum of the Los Angeles city streets faded into a sudden, violent darkness as Dillon ambushed Will right beside his vehicle. This was not merely an act of physical overpowering. It was the definitive shattering of Will's reality. Dragged away from the familiar, sunlit world of executive suites and oceanfront beach houses, Will was plunged into a suffocating nightmare crafted by a woman who had completely surrendered her humanity to her inner demons. The transition from the bustling city to the silent, oppressive trunk of a vehicle marked the beginning of a harrowing journey into absolute madness. Miles away from the glittering skyline of Los Angeles, nestled deep within the unforgiving, isolated terrain of the mountains, stood an old, decaying cabin. This structure, forgotten by time, battered by the elements, and hidden by towering, ancient pines, became the grim theater for Dylan's horrifying psychological play. The isolation of the mountain wilderness perfectly mirrored the chilling isolation of her mind. There were no neighbors to hear her scream, no passing cars to offer salvation, and no cell service to connect to the outside world. It was a perfectly constructed vacuum of terror where Dylan could reign supreme over her captive audience of one. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating stench of obsession, old dust, and decaying wood. Dylan had spent days meticulously transforming the rotting space into a macabre, overwhelming shrine dedicated entirely to the brief, fleeting moments she had shared with Will. Every inch of the peeling walls, every available surface of the rusted furniture, was plastered with photographs, stolen mementos, and frantic, obsessive scribbles detailing their short-lived romance. It was a visual representation of a mind that had completely shattered, a terrifying mosaic of a love that had mutated into a deadly disease. When Will finally regained consciousness, the physical reality of his nightmare set in with agonizing, heart-stopping clarity. The cold, unforgiving bite of heavy, iron-wrought chains bound his wrists and ankles securely to a massive, immovable bed frame in the center of the room. His initial grogginess, likely the result of whatever chemical agent Dylan had used to subdue him, was violently ripped away by the sheer terror of his surroundings. The metallic clinking of the chains echoing in the silent cabin was the only sound accompanying his racing heartbeat as the realization of his complete and utter helplessness washed over him like a tidal wave of ice. Across the dim, flickering light cast by a single, swinging overhead bulb, Dylan emerged from the shadows of the cabin. The woman standing before him was completely devoid of the Melissa Dylan he once knew. The vulnerability, the guilt, and the soft-spoken demeanor were entirely gone. Her eyes, which once held a quiet longing, now burned with a manic, terrifying conviction that chilled Will to the absolute marrow of his bones. She looked upon him not with the love of a partner, but with the possessive, unyielding hunger of a captor who had finally secured her ultimate prize. Dylan had shed the last remnants of her sanity, replacing it with a monstrous obsession that recognized no boundaries. Dylan's demands quickly escalated into a dissonant symphony of psychological torture. She did not ask for a financial ransom, nor did she seek revenge in the traditional sense. She demanded the complete surrender of his soul and his memories. Standing over his chained, defenseless form, she commanded Will to verbally and emotionally recreate the specific romantic moments they had once shared. It was a grotesque, sickening pantomime, an enforcement of affection through the unspoken but ever-present threat of untold violence. She forced him to recite words of love, analyzing his tone and his facial expressions for any sign of deception or resistance. The psychological torment reached devastating new heights as Dylan insisted that Will completely and permanently erase Electra Forster from his memory. Every time Will hesitated, every time a flicker of defiance or sorrow crossed his eyes, Dylan's erratic behavior would spike into terrifying, unpredictable outbursts of rage. She screamed that Electra was a phantom, an obstacle that had been permanently removed from their destiny. She demanded that he look at her and see his only future, his only reality, completely devoid of Electra's existence. The mental exhaustion of trying to placate a madwoman while fighting to hold onto his true love pushed Will to the absolute brink of human endurance. However, the true, unfathomable depth of Dylan's depravity reached a horrifying crescendo when she unveiled the final, most twisted layer of her delusion. Disappearing into the darker shadows of the cabin for a few moments, she returned to the dim light, wearing clothes that were absolutely identical to those Electra frequently wore. The visual shock of seeing his unhinged captor masquerading as the woman he truly loved sent a visceral, paralyzing wave of nausea through Will's entire body. It was a violation of his senses, a brutal manipulation designed to break his spirit completely. This macabre masquerade was an agonizing assault on Will's visual and emotional faculties. Dylan paraded around the confined space of the cabin, eerily mimicking Elektra's specific mannerisms, her unique style of movement, and even attempting to replicate the cadence of her voice. All the while, she demanded that Will profess his undying love to her, calling her by the pet names he reserved only for Elektra. It was a sickening, desperate attempt to merge her own identity with her rival's, hoping to violently trick Will's heart and mind into ultimate submission. Bound and battered, Will found himself trapped in an agonizing internal conflict, forcing smiles and coerced words of affection just to survive another hour. Meanwhile, back in the sprawling, sun-drenched landscape of Los Angeles, the sudden and inexplicable disappearance of Will Spencer sent silent, creeping shockwaves through the lives of those he left behind. Elektra Forrester, still emotionally reeling from the devastating fallout of her Aunt Ivy's manipulations and her own heartfelt confession to Will, initially believed that he simply needed space. She assumed he had retreated to the beach house to process the overwhelming betrayals and the complex web of their fractured romance. She gave him time, hoping that when he was ready, he would return to her with an open heart. However, as hours agonizingly turned into days, the silence grew utterly deafening. The lingering anger and confusion Elektra harbored toward the situation slowly dissolved into a creeping, undeniable dread that settled heavily in her chest. Her intuition, sharply honed by the recent betrayal she had endured, screamed that something was fundamentally, terribly wrong. Well, Spencer was a man of action and responsibility. He was not the type of man to simply vanish without a trace, abandoning his career at Forrester Creations and leaving his loved ones in a state of agonizing limbo. In a dramatic twist of fate, Elektra's growing panic forced her into a highly uneasy but necessary alliance with R.J. Forrester. R.J., who had been actively trying to win Elektra's affections and had previously fueled Dylan's obsessive hopes, found himself caught in the devastating crossfire of his own indirect actions. When Elektra voiced her fears about Will's disappearance, R.J.'s lingering guilt over his harsh, manipulative dismissal of Dylan began to gnaw viciously at his conscience. He remembered the manic desperation in Dylan's eyes when he told her not to give up, and a horrifying realization began to take root in his mind. Driven by an overwhelming desperation and a shared sense of foreboding, Elektra and R.J. took it upon themselves to investigate the sudden disappearance. Their frantic search naturally led them to the one person who had been acting increasingly erratic and isolated in the days leading up to the vanishing, Melissa Dillon. When they realized Dillon was also missing from her usual routines, the decision to breach her privacy and search her personal quarters was born out of pure, unadulterated desperation. They needed answers, and they needed them before time ran out for Will. The invasion of Dylan's private space yielded a discovery that chilled Elektra and R.J. to the very marrow of their bones. Hidden away among mundane belongings, they uncovered a terrifying cache of evidence. Spread across a desk were detailed, meticulously annotated maps pointing toward a remote, heavily forested mountainous region far outside the city limits. The maps were covered in frantic, obsessive notations, highlighted routes, and circled isolated areas that painted a clear, undeniable, and horrifying picture of premeditated abduction. It was the blueprint of a madwoman's ultimate fantasy. The realization struck Elektra and R.J. with the devastating force of a physical blow. The woman they had severely underestimated, the woman they thought was merely a tragic nuisance in their complex romantic entanglements, was in fact a highly dangerous, unhinged predator. The maps were not just pieces of paper. They were a terrifying window into the nightmare that was currently enduring. The guilt washed over R.J. in suffocating waves, realizing his careless words had ignited this catastrophic inferno, while Electra was consumed by a fierce, protective rage. A frantic, heart-pounding race against time instantly ignited. Electra, fueled by a fierce, undeniable love for the man she had so recently pushed away, mobilized every ounce of her strength. She and RJ practically flew out of the building, the sprawling, treacherous mountain roads becoming the only barrier standing between them and the man they desperately needed to save. The stakes had entirely transcended corporate rivalries, fashion show successes, and petty jealousies. It was now a harrowing matter of life and death. As they sped toward the unforgiving wilderness, they could only pray that will possess